Good morning and welcome to the guided tour visits of the Juan Carlos Maldonado Art Collection of the exhibition of Ernesto Briel titled Iridescent Geometries through the sponsorship Art Basel 2020 Miami Beach. The Juan Carlos Maldonado Art Collection, since its inception in 2005, has focused itself in the direction of geometric abstraction. It has been recognizing and waking awareness on the contribution that geometric abstraction has made to our history into the 20th century, as well as the influences of geometric abstraction into contemporary art and the 21st century as well. In 2016, the JCMAC, as it is known, the Juan Carlos Maldonado Art Collection in Miami, has begun a new chapter, opening its acclaimed exhibition space in the Miami Design District and becoming part of the cultural identity of the city of Miami. It has as well inspired and create a meaningful dialogue around the artists and the collection and their transcendence internationally. Under the direction of its founder and chairman, Juan Carlos Maldonado, the Juan Carlos Maldonado Art Collection has placed geometric abstraction at its center, studying and recognizing the fundamental artistic languages for the development of contemporary art and modern art in the context of historical references to the genre. With the title Iridescent Geometries, the curator Ariel Jimenez, a curator of Venezuelan origin who is very well known internationally, it pretends and directs the works of Ernesto Briel into the realm of contemporary art. With this, the JCMAC hopes to make a supplementary contribution to the study of abstract arts in Cuba, where political circumstances made the development of an art that was thought of as an autonomous practice and almost impossible to reach beyond the island in the 1960s. Not because it was disinterested in the political challenges of the 20th century, but because of the isolation that created in itself. We are going to focus this guided visit through the development, dexterity, and influences that the artist Ernesto Briel received through the international influences in the island, as well as the impact that he had, not only locally, but internationally in the further years after he left the island. This exhibition is mostly based on the works of 1960s and 70s, works that are in essence monochromatic and that use only two tools to express themselves: Indian ink and paper, not only based on the scarcity of the elements that they had, given the isolation that the island had in the 1960s, but as well as a challenge in terms of creativity that Ernesto Briel had in his times. Geometric abstraction as we know it, or even more so, concrete art, was born as a consequence of a radicalization in abstract trends at the beginning of the 20th century. The goal was to create a strictly human and cerebral art capable of generating emotion and meaning in total independence from natural forms of. In this case, geometry in itself became a flag for a number of movements that started in the early 20th century, as it has been studied by the collection, and developed through the 1930s with the hiatus that was caused due to World War II that developed in itself an origin and a rebirth of geometric abstraction through Latin America and eventually in the 1950s in Europe. But the forms that are born in this way, geometrically speaking, apart from a very strict conceptual and metaphysical requirement. And as such, the title, as titled by Ariel Jimenez, Iridescent Geometries, in the works of Ernesto Briel, have very much a reference to the celestial bodies in which he was at one point referring his initial drawings. One in particular was the one that attracted the title to this exhibition. And this work from 1979 refers specifically to not only the mathematical formations of geometry, in this case circles, as well as the optical effects that generated an interest and curiosity on the works of Ernesto Briel. Historically speaking, we have to figure out that optical art was not coined until 1964 after an exhibition at the Martha Jackson Gallery of the works of Stansack, in which op art was described as a generative form of art that, if you will see in the following work, excerpts based on two absolute lines and polarization. And then again, we go to the celestial bodies that made a lot of influence in this movement in particular, of works that manifest through very simple forms and in monochromatic ways the manifestos of optical art. This work, created in 1966-67, that belongs to the Juan Carlos Maldonado Art Collection, is a very good example of such principles. Lines, circles, all manifest in one specific pattern, creating an optical effect that leads us to believe that there's two interposition um, dimensions, and at the same time, and in its most simple form, referring to the simplicity that the terms of optical art are always very well known for. Optical art in itself can be traced back to Bauhaus, in which the principles of deconstructing pieces in black and white, as we will see in some works further on, are based on the idea that simplicity is its main basic form of manifesto. Ernesto Briel in the 1960s had to confront not only the scarcity of materials, but at the same time, the advent of a new form of art in Cuba that basically curtailed the evolution of what abstractionism was following through. Under the principles of geometric abstraction, there were movements that generated interest in the late 1950s, specifically concrete art, 1958. But by 1962, under official and not official laws, the uh, social realism was mostly favored. And in that sense, the challenges that Riel had to establish.
Having, having said that the first uh, chapter of this exhibition is based upon the three titles that the curator Ariel Jimenez established for such generating forms is the one that we are going to focus on now. The L pieces are formally based on three of the most elementary figures in geometry: the square, the triangle, and the circle.
They are, in every form and shape, the most fundamental principles of industry in the modern world. Repetition, superposition, displacement, all principles that focus on geometric abstraction. As we said in the beginning, most of the early works of Ernesto Riel had a transcendency that was definitely non-ephemeral and extremely profound. The circle, in this case, is manifest in the subtle manner that not only shows us his dexterity as a draftsman, but at the same time, the intelligence of his manifestos. Most of them, and if you can appreciate these ones in particular, they have effects that are only perceived at a distance in which spaces are separated, creating rays of light, which is nothing but an optical effect. That optical effect is manifest not only at raw visualization, but at the same time in the way that sometimes you take photograph of them, evolving into forms, again, using the circle as a principle, is extremely amazing how his dexterity to manifest, again, celestial bodies in forms that are deeply based on the manifestos of optical art. These two works in particular are very mathematical in their execution. If you would be able to observe the drafts that he made before establishing those forms, you will see that they were extremely generative. And by generative, I am speaking specifically about the algorithms used in the early 1960s to generate forms that will multiply themselves in a repetitive manner and that will expand themselves into the universe. And that's, I think, one of the most beautiful aspects of geometry. Geometry is mostly based not only on the most simple structures, like you will see in this one, but through the most complex one, as you will see in this one, which is a complete reflection of human nature, space nature, and definitely universal nature and sense. One of the important aspects that you have to consider on the life of Ernesto Briel, after he graduated in 1964 from the famous Academy of San Alejandro, he had to have been influenced by the early manifestos of optical art. From the 1957 exhibition of Le Mouvement of Denis René to the manifestos of 1962 and 1964, as I said, on the optical art exhibit of Martha Jackson, but at the same time of the responsive eye exhibition of 1966. You have to figure out that these works were created exactly during that period, 1966. This is a period in which the MoMA presented an exhibition that was widely acclaimed by the public, but completely rejected by the critics of the time, but eventually accepted as a form of manifesto that will be deeply embedded in the optical and as well as the pop art in all the commercial manifestation of the 1960s and early 70s. This is rather interesting because by 1966, the first exhibition of optical art in Cuba happens, only with two artists participating in this, Armando Morales and Ernesto Briel. Just at the same time, the MoMA exhibit is being presented in New York. And in the same year that Julio Leparc, another important contributor to the optical art principles in the late 1950s, he received again in 1966 the Leon d'Or Award by the Venice Biennial, representing not only Argentine, but the movement Grave, which is the group of de recherche de les arts visuels, or the group of research for the visual arts that had very much an embedded manifesto into the optical art, geometry, and the interaction that this art has to have with the public. This painting in particular invites not only contemplation, but references to the work of Vasarely are immediately evident. We have to realize that Vasarely, the father of what's considered nowadays op art, was the one that in 1938 started to explore first through manifestos of black and white, and then later through commercial banners that use optical art as a principle as well as geometric abstraction in evolving into what in the late 1950s became well known as a movement itself. Ernesto Briel had, as I said, a scarcity of materials at hand. Some of his works had to be painted with what he had. Again, we go to the basic elements of Indian ink and paper, but paper was scarce given the isolation that the political circumstances of the time were producing. Among those papers that he had to reach and draw into it was photographic paper that came from Czechoslovakia. Here we go back then to the international influences on the work of Ernesto Briel. Vasarely, as I mentioned before, was Hungarian, and Hungary was back then part of the socialist bloc. Countries that had, at that particular point, and given the isolation that they had with the Western world, an influence on the form and the arts of Cuba of its time. This work in particular has a manifesto that is extremely interesting, as it is this 4 lines, unexistent completely, but in your brain. The interconnection and the transposition of the movement of the circle translate into empty spaces that most definitely have reference to what I said before, algorithm or algorithmic expressions in geometry that lead the brain to have an interpretation of a form that is completely unexistent, but in a very bidimensional way, and translated by your brain in a three-dimensional format. By 1970s, Brielle had already access to uh, a batch of papers, all of them practically of the same size, and hence the uniformity on some of the works that he was presenting. You have to, at the same time, uh, think of Brielle as one who was born in 1943, who had witnessed revolutions in so many ways and forms. First one, the social political one of his country, and second one, his sexual orientation. Unfortunately for him, the persecution of homosexuality in the island became officially established by 1967-69, and by 1970 was punished not only by jail, but by absolute isolation. He was separated from his teaching positions, as were many intellectuals who had professed their sexual orientation, specifically homosexuality. And under such circumstances, he dedicated himself to a movement that not only did not have commercial implications, but was not fashionable, or at one point not even considered art according to the critics of back then, the interpreters of such in America. These works in particular, you can see, are very geometric in their perception, but at the same time, optical in the optical illusions that they produce. All of them, as you can see, are the same size, work all on the same paper, and again, within the simplicity that we manifest previously. The forms that they have produce the second part on the curatorial interpretations of Ariel Jimenez. This section is described as being of dynamic effects. Some of them in person create even the illusion of different colors. The results of applying these principles of repetition, superposition, and displacement to basic geometric shapes are in itself the appearance of a series of optical effects, often, as the title of the exhibition says, in iridescent and dynamic form. Painting these functions, it was sort of a kind of an aesthetic machine in perfect harmony with the world in which they were basically nurtured. And this was the brain of Ernesto Briel. By 1970s, the influence of other artists was evident in almost everywhere in which the optical art was of manifest. And specifically, I'm going to speak of Bridget Riley. This was an exercise produced by Ernesto Briel based on one painting and specifically on the principles of opticity that Bridget Riley applied in her canvas. This work is a very good example of the international influences that yet reach Cuba, regardless of the embargo that they were going through in the late 1960s and early 70s. And it speaks as well of the solidarity of many artists that develop a presence and evident, I mean, is evident that influence some of the works of Ernesto Briel. Another sector of his work that had to do with op and pop, as it was manifested in his first exhibition in 1966, is the fact that in the early 1970s, the government of Cuba asked artists to interpret urban signs, and as such, they had to manifest in each form in which they specialize themselves, urban forms that would describe, in this case, traffic signs. You can see that he took two forms to manifest themselves. Again, we go back to the dynamic effects of the three principles of the circle and the square lines, but you can see that this is sort of like a tire mark on the street. that is referring and alluding to different signs used not only by graphic designers of the time, but taking on the work of Ernesto Briel specific directives. Again, we're interpreting urban signs through optical and pop art in itself. The traffic lights, the go this way signs, or the opposite signs that you will normally see on the street. Some of those even referring to railroad crossings. His interpretation not only speaks of the dexterity of his hand, but of the capacity that he had to apply a very urban and common form into an optical effect that will at the same time derive on the popularity of pop art. The third stage of the exhibition, again as curated by Ariel Jimenez, has to do not only with the form and the shapes itself, but with the principles in which he at one point had based his art. This one in particular, it's a manifesto of the Golden Rule, in which the Fibonacci expresses itself as it would in the early paintings of the 15th and 16th century, which is really important, I think, because I believe that Briel can be compared to many artists from the 16th and 17th century with such scarcity of materials and placing themselves into a philosophical as well as an ethereal way of painting. To me, to my mind, comes the Prince of Robert Flood, who used the black and white as his main elements and who was interpreting the universe in his own astrophysical way of seeing things without the instruments to really research them. This one in particular makes reference to the constructions and the compositions that I mentioned before, which is like by 1920, 1921, the teachings of Joseph Albers on deconstructing the form and giving different forms using the same elements in it were basic principles of developing a thinking mind into the process of creativity. These same principles were eventually translated and taken to Black Mountain College in the United States and established forms of research that as of today continues to reverberate in contemporary art. The difference of these artworks with the rest that we saw before is the use of photographic Czechoslovakian paper. Some of these speaks mostly of the way in which Ernesto Briel distracted himself, not only from being isolated, and as Pedro de Ora plays in one of his writings, a loner in himself. He loved to create in a very isolated form, which in many ways nurtured all of these works produced in the 1960s and 70s based on the principles that not only was he isolating himself, but the island in itself was isolated. This is a beautiful scientific form of expressing optical art in which he cuts circles and displaces them without necessarily cutting the way in which they were diametrically and symmetrically placed. The squares, unexistent but only to your brain, through the interpretation of the cuts that he created. And if you will see, if he will have finished the circle, that circle will have interfered with the one next to it. By cutting it, not only he gave the circle an amazing optical manifesto of the square, of the triangle, and on the circle. Again, we go back to the generating forms that Ariel Jimenez referred himself to. The basic principles of geometry manifested in an optical form. You will see that those same forms generate other forms, like in this case, an heptagon. One interesting fact it was that his friends, intellectual friends, that wanted to support him during this period of isolation, given his sexual orientation, helped him to be an artist of popular demand. He was frequently featured in a magazine that pretended to bring literacy to Cuba. The name of the magazine was Signos. And all of these drawings participated or were illustrated in the Signos uh, uh, booklet publication that was mostly done from 1965 all the way through 1977 in a bi-monthly way. One of the principles that I was talking to you in terms of the influences of international artists and teachings is the beginning of Bauhaus. This again, as the previous exercise that we saw of Bridget Riley, is one that manifests the early teachings of Joseph Albers and the deconstruction and decomposition that Bauhaus was generating back then. Artists that originated the most strict principles of geometric abstraction were the ones in which Ernesto Briel based his studies upon and beyond. Repetition forms in generic matter. Remember, generic matter in mathematical terms is the use of algorithms to, in a repetitive form, multiplicate the form in a universal or endless way. As such, this is a great example. One in which you can see different forms being manifest as well as the constructions in itself. We see Bridget Riley, we see Vasarely, we see Joseph Albers, but above all, we see Ernesto Briel. And to finish, just to show you 6 works in which those forms are generating not only an optical effect, but as Ariel Jimenez expressed in the title of this exhibition, an iridescent geometry, in which just by observing an object that resembles a celestial body can be interpreted in 4 different forms. The circle, the square, which is generated within, and in simple elements, which are Indian ink and paper. All of them in a developing, evolving, contemplative, almost minimalistic or minimalist, I'm sorry, and definitely optic. Ernesto Briel is one of those curious cultural manifestations in which aesthetics are born from demanding and precise conceptual principles. That has been the opportunity that the Juan Carlos Maldonado art collection has given us to discover an artist that is not necessarily well known in historical terms, but whose adopting of geometric abstraction and interpreting of optical art has given us a human size of his presence as well as of his artistic weight. Uh, the Juan Carlos Maldonado art collection is convinced that by expanding the aesthetic boundaries of the community in which inhabits, whatever it might be, the possibilities of reaching a social equilibrium within the city and internationally, it manifests an artistic and cultural identity that is very much needed in these times in which we're going through. Most definitely, we are through the process of these exhibits, and thanks to the Juan Carlos Maldonado art collection, enriching humanity's expression through the tools that implies not only a cultural position, but definitely not necessarily limited by a space. Thank you very much, and I hope that you really enjoy our presentation. Thank you.